A black boy helps a woman in a wheelchair, not realizing who her son is. This act of kindness will be the beginning of an incredible change in his life. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and don't forget to write in the comments where you're watching us from. The late afternoon sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the city streets. Darius clutched his battered schoolbag as he walked briskly toward home. The weight of the day lingered heavily on his shoulders, not just from schoolwork but from the constant reminders of the struggles his family faced. Rent overdue, his little sister's worn shoes, and the ever-growing list of worries his mother tried to hide behind a tired smile. The only solace he found was in his sketches. Dreams etched onto crinkled paper of soaring skyscrapers and elegant bridges. But dreams felt so distant when every step reminded him of the reality he lived. As he turned a corner onto the main road, bustling with people rushing to their destinations, Darius noticed her. An older white woman, seated in a motorized wheelchair, looked frail and disoriented. She was parked near a lamppost, her trembling hands fumbling with the controls. The crowd moved around her like water splitting against a stone, barely glancing her way. Darius slowed his pace, watching as her expression grew more panicked with each passing moment. She tried again to maneuver the wheelchair, but it lurched awkwardly, bumping against the curb. Her thin voice called out, almost lost amidst the chatter of the street. "Excuse me, can someone help me?" No one stopped. Darius felt a pang of frustration and something else, an urge he couldn't quite place. He hesitated for a moment. His mother always told him to be careful around strangers, especially in this part of the city. But then he saw her shoulders slump in defeat, her head bowing slightly, as if surrendering to the indifference of the world around her. Taking a deep breath, he approached. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, stopping a few steps away. His voice carried the uncertainty of someone who rarely spoke up to strangers. "Do you need help?" The woman looked up sharply, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. For a moment she seemed startled, perhaps even wary, but the desperation in her face softened into a flicker of hope. "Oh, thank goodness," she murmured. I can't seem to get this thing to work properly, and I'm not sure where I am. Can you help me?" Darius glanced at the wheelchair. It seemed intact, but her hands were shaking too much to control it. The buzzing hum of the motor sounded faintly as she attempted to press the joystick again, but the machine barely moved. "Where are you trying to go?" he asked. She paused, struggling to recall. I live on Maplewood Drive. Do you know it? It's not far, I think, but I can't seem to get there." Maplewood Drive was at least a 20-minute walk from here, he realized. She must have wandered far without realizing it. Darius frowned, glancing at the crowd that continued to swirl around them. No one even paused to notice the interaction. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help you get there." Her face lit up with relief, but just as she opened her mouth to thank him, she swayed slightly in her chair. Her eyes fluttered, and for a heart-stopping moment, Darius thought she might faint. He reached out instinctively, steadying her shoulder. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She murmured something faint and incoherent, her head drooping forward. Darius's pulse quickened. He looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to help, but the passers-by avoided his gaze. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice firm but anxious. He remembered his mother's advice about fainting spells. Keep the person hydrated and upright if possible. He spotted a small convenience store across the street and made a split-second decision. "I'll be right back. Don't move." He sprinted to the store, narrowly avoiding a collision with a cyclist, and grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator. The cashier eyed him warily as he slammed down a handful of coins, the exact change he always kept for emergencies. Without waiting for a receipt, he dashed back. The woman was still slumped, but she stirred when he pressed the cool bottle against her hand. Carefully, he opened the cap and tilted the bottle to her lips. She sipped weakly, her breathing growing steadier. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. Darius exhaled, relieved but still uneasy. He wasn't sure if she needed medical attention, but calling an ambulance felt like too much. She was lucid, just weak. He had to get her home. "We'll go slow," he said. "I'll push the chair. Don't worry about the controls." She nodded faintly, her trust in him unspoken but clear. Gripping the handles of the wheelchair, Darius began the journey toward Maplewood Drive. The path wasn't easy. The sidewalks were uneven, cracked, and cluttered with obstacles. Several times he had to maneuver the heavy chair around parked bikes, garbage cans, and even a car half blocking the walkway. The weight of the chair and the strain on his arms grew with each step, but he didn't stop. As they continued, the woman spoke in fragmented sentences. "I was trying to get to the market," she explained, "but I took the wrong turn. I get so confused sometimes. My son, he usually helps me, but he's so busy." Darius listened quietly, sensing her embarrassment. "It's okay," he said simply. "Everyone gets lost sometimes." The journey felt longer than it was. Darius couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Some pedestrians glanced at him curiously, their faces unreadable. He overheard snippets of murmurs, comments about a shady kid and "what's he doing with her?" But he ignored them. Every time he looked at the woman's frail form, the doubts melted away. She needed him. By the time they reached Maplewood Drive, the sky had deepened into twilight. The neighborhood was starkly different from Darius's. Clean, quiet, with rows of pristine houses surrounded by manicured lawns. He found the address she had described, a 2-story brick house with wide windows and a ramp leading to the front door. Darius knocked firmly, his knuckles brushing against the polished wood. He heard footsteps, brisk and purposeful, before the door swung open. A man stood there, tall and imposing, dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks. His sharp blue eyes flicked between Darius and the woman in the wheelchair, narrowing slightly. "Mom, what happened?" he asked, his tone laced with concern and suspicion. "She got lost," Darius explained quickly. "She wasn't feeling well, so I brought her home." The man's gaze lingered on Darius, assessing him, before softening as he knelt beside his mother. "Are you all right?" he asked her gently. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her voice was still weak. "Thanks to this young man." The man straightened, his expression unreadable as he looked at Darius. "Thank you," he said finally. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped her." "It's no problem," Darius replied, suddenly self-conscious. "I just wanted to make sure she got home safe." The man hesitated before stepping back and opening the door wider. "Come inside. I think we owe you more than just a thank you." Darius glanced at the threshold, unsure, before reluctantly stepping inside, unaware of how this moment would alter the course of his life forever. The air inside the grand foyer was cool, a stark contrast to the humid streets Darius had trudged through. The smell of polished wood and fresh flowers filled his nose, a sharp departure from the faint scent of exhaust and damp concrete outside. Darius hesitated just inside the doorway, clutching the handles of the wheelchair as the man, whom he now assumed was the woman's son, gently ushered his mother further inside. "Sit here, Mom," the man said, his tone softening as he guided the wheelchair toward a plush chair near the living room. "I'll get you some water." Darius watched, uncertain whether he should stay or go. His sneakers left faint smudges on the pristine marble floor, and he felt the weight of the house pressing in on him. High ceilings, elaborate crown molding, and paintings in gilded frames that looked older than his entire neighborhood. This wasn't a place he belonged. The man returned quickly, holding a glass of water, which he handed to his mother before turning his attention to Darius. "So," he began, his voice calm but edged with curiosity, "what exactly happened?" Darius shifted awkwardly, his hands gripping the straps of his bag. "She was stuck," he said simply. "Her chair wasn't working right, and she fainted for a bit. I couldn't just leave her there." The man studied him for a moment, as though weighing the truth in his words. Finally, he nodded, the suspicion in his expression softening. "Well, I appreciate it. You didn't have to do all that." He extended a hand. "I'm Richard." Darius hesitated, then shook it. "Darius." "Darius," Richard repeated, as if trying the name on for size. He glanced back at his mother, who was slowly sipping the water. "She's lucky you were there." "It's not a big deal," Darius said, looking down at his feet. "It is," Richard insisted, his tone firm but not unkind. "A lot of people wouldn't have stopped to help." He paused, his gaze narrowing slightly. "You look like you've had a rough day yourself. Where are you coming from?" "School," Darius replied. He didn't elaborate. He didn't want to. Richard nodded again, his eyes flicking briefly to Darius's worn shoes and the frayed strap of his backpack. He seemed to be weighing something, though what, Darius couldn't tell. "You hungry?" Richard asked abruptly. Darius blinked. "What?" "Are you hungry?" Richard repeated, gesturing toward the kitchen. "It's the least I can do." Before Darius could answer, Richard was already walking toward the kitchen. Darius glanced at the older woman. Catherine? Caroline? He hadn't caught her name earlier, and she gave him a faint smile, as if encouraging him to follow. Reluctantly, he did. The kitchen was as immaculate as the rest of the house, with granite countertops and sleek appliances that gleamed under the warm light. Richard opened the refrigerator, pulling out the cold cuts, bread, and cheese. "Hope you don't mind a sandwich," he said, setting the items on the counter. Darius shook his head, still too bewildered to speak. The entire situation felt surreal. How had he gone from pushing a broken wheelchair through cracked sidewalks to standing in this spotless kitchen, being offered food by a man who looked like he ran a Fortune 500 company? As Richard prepared the sandwich, he glanced over his shoulder. "So, Darius, where do you live?" Darius hesitated. "Lincoln Heights?" Richard paused, his hands stilling briefly before he resumed slicing the bread. "That's a bit of a hike from here." Darius shrugged. "It's not that far." Richard didn't press further. He finished making the sandwich and slid it across the counter to Darius, who mumbled a quick thanks before taking a bite. The bread was soft, the cheese rich. It tasted better than anything he'd had in weeks. He ate quickly, too aware of the way Richard's eyes lingered on him. After a moment, Richard spoke again. "You're a good kid, you know that?" Darius froze mid-bite. No one had ever called him that before, not in a way that felt genuine anyway. He swallowed, unsure how to respond. "I just did what anyone would do," he said finally. Richard leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Not anyone. Most people would have walked right past her. Hell, I've seen people do it before. Darius didn't know what to say to that, so he stayed silent, finishing the sandwich as quickly as he could. When he was done, Richard straightened and gestured toward the door. "Come on, I'll give you a ride home." Darius shook his head. "That's okay, I can walk." "It's late," Richard pointed out, his tone leaving little room for argument. "And I'd feel better knowing you got home safe." Darius wanted to argue. He wasn't used to accepting help from anyone, let alone someone like Richard, but he couldn't deny the exhaustion weighing on him. Finally, he nodded. "All right." They returned to the living room, where Richard helped his mother settle into a more comfortable chair before grabbing his car keys. As Darius followed him outside, he couldn't help but glance back at the house. It felt like another world, one he didn't belong to but couldn't help being drawn toward. The car was a sleek black sedan, the kind Darius had only seen in movies or parked in the wealthy neighborhoods he avoided. He climbed into the passenger seat, sinking into the plush leather as Richard started the engine. The drive was mostly quiet, aside from Richard asking for directions. Darius gave short, clipped answers, too aware of the way the man occasionally glanced at him, as if trying to piece him together. When they finally reached Lincoln Heights, the contrast was jarring. The neatly paved streets and manicured lawns of Maplewood Drive gave way to cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights. Richard slowed the car, his gaze sweeping over the run-down buildings and graffiti-covered walls. "This is it?" he asked. "Yeah," Darius said, unbuckling his seatbelt. He hesitated, then added, "Thanks for the ride." Richard nodded, but didn't move to restart the car. He watched as Darius climbed out and shouldered his bag, his gaze lingering on the boy as he walked toward the dimly lit apartment building. As Darius reached the door, he glanced back. Richard was still there, the car idling at the curb. For a moment, their eyes met, and Darius couldn't help but wonder what the man was thinking. Finally, Richard gave a small nod, almost to himself, before driving away. Darius watched the taillights disappear into the night, his mind swirling with questions he couldn't quite put into words. He stepped inside the building, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead grounding him back into reality. But even as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about tonight had shifted, like a door had opened, even if he didn't yet know where it led. The next morning, Darius awoke to the usual sounds of his neighborhood. Distant car horns, the rhythmic clank of garbage trucks, and the echoing calls of children playing outside before school. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and rolled out of bed, careful not to wake his sister Tasha, who was still fast asleep in the bed beside his. Their room was cramped, with clothes piled up in corners and school books scattered across the only desk. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a muted glow on the peeling wallpaper. As Darius pulled on his school uniform, worn at the elbows and slightly too small, he thought back to the events of the previous evening. The elderly woman, her son, the pristine house that seemed like something out of a movie. It all felt surreal. The man, Richard, had been oddly kind, offering Darius a ride home and even a meal. But Darius couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just kindness. There was curiosity in the way Richard looked at him, as if trying to understand who Darius really was. Darius shook off the thought, grabbed his bag, and slipped quietly out of the room. His mother, Cynthia, was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee. Her eyes were tired, dark circles etched beneath them, a permanent mark of the long shifts she worked as a home health aide. "Morning, Mom," he greeted her, trying to inject some cheer into his voice. She looked up and smiled, though the weariness was evident. "Morning, baby. You got in late last night. Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine," Darius replied, pouring himself a bowl of cereal. He hesitated, then added, I helped someone yesterday, an older woman in a wheelchair. She got lost downtown, so I helped her get home." Cynthia raised an eyebrow. "That's kind of you. You're always looking out for people." Her voice held a note of pride, but also concern. "You be careful, though, all right? You never know what kind of trouble you might run into out there." Darius nodded, though he chose not to mention the specifics, the fact that the woman lived in a fancy neighborhood, or that her son had driven him home. He didn't want his mother to worry more than she already did. As he finished his breakfast and headed out the door, Darius felt the weight of the day ahead of him. School was always a mixed bag. He loved learning, especially anything related to math and science, but he hated the judgmental looks from some of his classmates. Lincoln Heights wasn't exactly known for its high-performing students, and teachers often assumed the worst of him before he even spoke. But Darius had dreams, and he wouldn't let anyone's low expectations get in the way. The school day passed slowly, the hours blurring together in a haze of lectures, scribbled notes, and half-hearted attempts by teachers to keep the class engaged. By the time the final bell rang, Darius was ready to get out of there. He slung his bag over his shoulder and started the walk home, the weight of the day's frustrations pressing down on him. As he approached his apartment building, Darius noticed a black car parked at the curb. His steps slowed, a frown forming on his face. It was the same sleek sedan from the night before. The driver's side window rolled down, and Richard leaned out, giving Darius a small wave. "Hey, Darius," Richard called out. "Got a minute?" Darius glanced around, unsure. A few neighbors were outside, casting curious glances at the car and then at him. He could feel their eyes on him, wondering why someone like Richard would be here, talking to someone like him. Slowly, Darius walked over to the car. Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" Richard smiled, though there was a seriousness to his expression. "I wanted to talk to you. About yesterday." He gestured to the passenger seat. "Hop in?" Darius hesitated, his instincts telling him to be wary, but there was something in Richard's tone, a sincerity that made Darius nod reluctantly. He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, the leather seats cool against his back. Richard put the car in drive, slowly pulling away from the curb. "I hope you don't mind me showing up like this," he said. I wanted to thank you again, and I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in something." Darius frowned, glancing over at Richard. "What do you mean?" Richard paused, as if trying to find the right words. "My mother told me what you did for her yesterday. She said you were incredibly kind, patient, and responsible. You went out of your way to help her, even though you didn't have to. That says a lot about you." Darius shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just didn't want anything bad to happen to her." "I know," Richard said, his voice softening. "That's exactly why I wanted to see you. I know that Lincoln Heights isn't an easy place to grow up in, and I know that opportunities can be limited." He glanced at Darius, his gaze searching. "I want to help you, if you'll let me." Darius blinked, his mind racing. "Help me? How?" Richard smiled, a hint of excitement in his eyes. "I run a company, a construction company, actually. We design buildings, infrastructure, all kinds of things, and I could use someone like you, someone with a good heart who's willing to work hard. I'd like to offer you a part-time internship. You'd get to learn about architecture, engineering, the whole process, and, of course, you'd be paid for your time." Darius stared at him, stunned. An internship? At a real construction company? It sounded too good to be true. He felt a mixture of excitement and fear bubbling inside him. "But why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Richard's smile softened. "You're right. I don't know you, not yet, but I know enough to see that you're a good kid with potential. I want to help you get to where you want to go." Darius swallowed hard, his throat tight. He thought of his mother, of the long hours she worked just to keep a roof over their heads. He thought of his little sister, who looked up to him. This was a chance, maybe his only chance, to break free from the cycle that had trapped his family for so long. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Richard's smile widened, and he held out his hand. "Welcome aboard, then." Darius shook his hand, a sense of determination settling over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could change. Richard drove him back to his apartment, the car pulling up to the curb just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Darius climbed out, feeling a strange sense of hope as he watched the car drive away. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing ever was. But he had a chance now, and that was more than he'd ever had before. As he walked into the apartment building, Darius couldn't help but smile. He thought of the sketches he kept hidden under his bed, the ones of towering buildings, bridges spanning across cities. Maybe, just maybe, those dreams weren't so far out of reach after all. Darius woke up the next morning with a mix of excitement and nervousness coursing through his veins. The events of the previous day had been like a whirlwind, and he still couldn't believe it was real. An internship at Richard's construction company? It felt like something that only happened to people in movies, not to kids like him from Lincoln Heights. He rolled out of bed, careful not to disturb Tasha. She mumbled something in her sleep, her little face scrunching up before she turned over, snuggling deeper under the blanket. Darius smiled at her, the familiar warmth of responsibility swelling in his chest. She was the reason he had to make this work. He wanted a better life for her, a life where she didn't have to worry about rent or second-hand shoes. The kitchen was already bustling when Darius stepped in. His mother was frying eggs on their small, rusted stove, her hair pulled back hastily. She glanced up when she heard him. "Morning, baby," she greeted, her smile tired but genuine. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Darius hesitated for a moment before deciding he couldn't keep it to himself. "Mom, you're not going to believe what happened yesterday. The guy who drove me home? He offered me an internship at his company." Cynthia paused, the spatula hovering above the frying pan. She turned to face him, her eyes widening. "An internship? Darius, are you serious?" Darius nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, he runs a construction company. He said I could work part-time, learn about architecture and engineering, and I'd get paid for it too." For a moment, Cynthia was silent, her expression shifting from shock to pride and then to something more hesitant, a cautious hope that Darius knew all too well. "Are you sure this is real?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his. "I don't want you to get hurt if it turns out to be, too good to be true." Darius nodded. He understood her concern. Life had taught them both that good things didn't come easy. But there had been something genuine in Richard's eyes, a sincerity that Darius chose to trust. "I think it's real, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "I think this might be my chance." She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Oh, Darius, I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You've always been such a good boy. If anyone deserves a break, it's you." She pulled him into a hug, her embrace tight and comforting. Darius hugged her back, closing his eyes for a moment. He wished his father could see him now, but he knew that the pride in his mother's eyes was enough to keep him going. Later that day, after school, Darius found himself waiting outside his building, just as Richard had asked him to. The sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and Richard waved him over. Darius climbed in, feeling a bit more comfortable this time as he settled into the passenger seat. "Ready for your first day?" Richard asked with a smile. Darius nodded, though the nervous butterflies in his stomach made it hard to feel fully confident. "Yeah, I'm ready." The drive was smooth, the city passing by in a blur of streets, buildings, and bustling people. Richard glanced over at him every now and then, asking about the school and his family, making small talk to ease the tension. Darius answered politely, still feeling a bit overwhelmed by the whole situation. They eventually arrived at a large building, a modern office tower with reflective glass windows and sleek lines. Richard parked the car and led Darius inside, through a spacious lobby filled with people in business attire, all rushing about with purpose. Darius tried not to feel intimidated, though it was hard not to compare his frayed school uniform to the sharp suits around him. Richard placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder as they stepped into an elevator. "You'll do great, Darius," he said. "Everyone here knows you're my guest. They'll help you out." The elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, revealing a bustling workspace. Desks were arranged in clusters, papers and blueprints spread across surfaces, and people were busy typing on computers or discussing projects. The atmosphere was vibrant and alive, filled with the hum of conversations and the tapping of keyboards. Richard guided Darius through the maze of desks, introducing him to a few key people along the way: a young woman named Maria, who worked in design, a middle-aged man named Thomas, who handled the construction planning, and several interns who were just a few years older than Darius. Everyone greeted him warmly, their smiles genuine, though Darius couldn't help but feel a bit out of place. "All right, Darius, let's get you started," Richard said, leading him to a desk near Maria's. "This will be your space. For today, I just want you to get familiar with some of the basics. Maria will show you some blueprints, and you can help her organize the files." Darius nodded, his eyes wide as he took in the large table, covered with rolled-up blueprints and technical drawings. Maria smiled at him, her eyes kind. "Don't worry, I'll help you out," she said. "We'll start simple." The rest of the day went by in a blur. Maria was patient, explaining the basics of reading blueprints, how to understand the lines, the symbols, the measurements. Darius absorbed the information like a sponge, his mind racing with questions and a growing fascination for the details of the buildings they were designing. For the first time, the sketches he had drawn in his notebook at home seemed like they could be more than just dreams. They could become real. But there were also moments of doubt. During the lunch break, Darius sat alone at his desk, eating the sandwich he'd brought from home. He overheard snippets of conversations from the other interns, many of whom came from well-off backgrounds. They talked about their university classes, their plans for the summer, and their families' vacation homes. Darius tried not to let it get to him, but the feeling of being an outsider gnawed at him. As the day wound down, Richard returned to check on him. He found Darius still at his desk, poring over a set of blueprints, his brows furrowed in concentration. "How's it going?" Richard asked, leaning against the edge of the desk. Darius looked up startled, then smiled. "It's a lot to take in, but I like it." Richard nodded, his gaze appraising. "I knew you would. You've got the right mind for this, Darius. Just keep at it." Darius hesitated, then spoke, his voice quieter. I don't know if I really fit in here. Everyone else seems to know so much already. They're all in college, and I'm just—" "Hey," Richard interrupted gently. "Everyone starts somewhere. You're here because you have potential. You've got something that can't be taught. Determination, empathy, the willingness to do the right thing even when it's hard. The rest you'll learn. Don't worry about fitting in right away." Darius looked down at the blueprints, the lines blurring slightly as he thought about Richard's words. He nodded, a small smile forming. "Thanks, Richard. I'll do my best." Richard smiled back, giving Darius's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "That's all I ask." The drive home was quiet. Darius lost in thought as he watched the city pass by outside the car window. The sun was setting, casting the buildings in a warm, golden light. He felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from doing something meaningful. As they approached Lincoln Heights, Darius glanced at Richard. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for giving me this chance." Richard nodded, his eyes softening. "You earned it, Darius. Just keep believing in yourself, all right?" Darius stepped out of the car, watching as Richard drove away before turning to head into his building. The familiar sounds of his neighborhood greeted him. Laughter, distant music, the chatter of neighbors. It was home, but for the first time, Darius felt like there was something more out there for him, something he could reach for. When he got inside, Tasha ran up to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. "Did you build a skyscraper?" Darius chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not yet, Tash, but maybe one day." He sat down with her, pulling out his notebook of sketches. They flipped through the pages together, Tasha's eyes lighting up as she pointed at the buildings he'd drawn. Darius felt a warmth spread through him, the weight of the day's doubts lifting. He was doing this for her, for his mom, for all of them, and maybe, just maybe, he'd build something that could change all their lives. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Darius. Each day after school, he would head to Richard's construction company, his heart racing with both excitement and nerves. The office had begun to feel like a second home, though it was a very different kind of home than the one he knew in Lincoln Heights. There, people wore crisp clothes, spoke in confident tones, and lived lives that seemed to come out of a different world than his. The initial days were spent learning the basics, how to read and interpret blueprints, understanding construction terms, and organizing files. Darius spent hours with Maria, listening carefully to her explanations, his eyes soaking in the details of the blueprints she unfurled in front of him. The first few days were tough. There were so many lines, symbols, and notations that it felt overwhelming. He worried he would mess up, or worse, that he just wouldn't be able to understand. But Maria was patient, and she saw in Darius a genuine passion that she was eager to nurture. One particular afternoon, Maria had asked Darius to organize a set of blueprints that detailed an upcoming office building project. He was at his desk, carefully rolling up each sheet and labeling them, when he overheard a conversation between two other interns at the desk across from his. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying in the otherwise quiet office. "So, you heard about the new kid, right?" one of them said, a boy named Connor. He was tall, always dressed in perfectly pressed shirts, and was apparently studying civil engineering at a prestigious university. "Yeah, the one Richard brought in? What's his deal?" replied another intern, a girl named Jessica. Connor shrugged. "No idea. I heard he's not even in college. Probably some kind of charity case." Darius's hands paused mid-roll, his jaw clenching. He felt the familiar sting of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He had known it was only a matter of time before someone would say something like that. He kept his eyes fixed on the blueprints, trying to pretend he hadn't heard. But it was hard. The words seemed to echo in his mind. Charity case. The next few days, Darius found it harder to concentrate. The words from the interns lingered, gnawing at him, filling him with doubts that maybe he didn't belong here after all. Every time he sat down at his desk, every time he looked at the blueprints, a part of him questioned if he'd ever truly be able to understand them the way the others did. One afternoon, Richard noticed Darius sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a set of papers. He approached quietly, his brows furrowed. "Hey, Darius," Richard said, leaning against the desk. "Everything okay? You seem a bit distracted lately." Darius hesitated, then sighed, looking up. "It's just, I don't know if I really belong here," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone else knows so much more than I do. They're all in college, and I'm just a high school kid from Lincoln Heights." Richard studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, when I first started out, I didn't know anything either," he said. "I made mistakes, big ones. I questioned myself every single day. But you know what I learned?" Darius shook his head, his eyes fixed on Richard. "I learned that no one starts out knowing everything," Richard continued. "Everyone has to learn, and everyone starts from the beginning. You're not here because I'm doing you a favor, Darius. You're here because you've got the drive and the potential. You've got something that can't be taught. Determination, empathy, and a willingness to learn. And that's more important than anything else." Darius looked down at the blueprints in front of him. The lines and symbols that had felt so intimidating now seemed a little less daunting. He nodded slowly, a small smile forming on his face. "Thanks, Richard." Richard patted his shoulder, his smile warm. "You're going to be great, Darius. Just keep at it." With renewed determination, Darius threw himself into his work. He stayed late, poring over blueprints, making notes, and practicing the concepts Maria taught him. He knew he had to work twice as hard as the others to catch up, but he was willing to do it. One Friday evening, Maria handed Darius a new assignment. It was different from the others, a series of simple blueprints for a community center that the company was planning to renovate. It wasn't a big project, but it was the first time Darius was being trusted to take the lead on something. His heart pounded with excitement and fear as he carefully laid the blueprints on his desk. For the next week, Darius worked tirelessly on the project. He spent hours at the office sketching out ideas, asking Maria for feedback and making adjustments. He was determined to prove himself, not just to the others, but to himself. He wanted to show that he belonged, but things weren't always easy. One day, as Darius was working late, Connor and a few other interns walked by. They glanced at the blueprints spread out on his desk, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Wow, they've got you working on the kitty projects, huh?" Connor said, his tone mocking. "Must be nice to have someone like Richard backing you up." Darius clenched his jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. He kept his eyes on the blueprints, his focus unwavering. He knew why he was here, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. A few days later, Richard gathered the team for a meeting to discuss the community center project. He invited Darius to present his ideas, something that caught Darius completely off guard. Standing in front of a room filled with experienced architects and interns, Darius felt his palms grow sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, his hands slightly trembling as he unrolled the blueprints on the table. This is my concept for the community center renovation," Darius began, his voice shaky. "I wanted to create a space that feels welcoming, especially for the kids in the neighborhood. I thought it would be important to add an outdoor garden area where they could play, and a small library inside for after-school activities." He continued, explaining his ideas in as much detail as he could, his confidence growing with each word. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Darius's heart felt like it was about to burst as he waited for someone to speak. Richard was the first to break the silence, his face breaking into a broad smile. "This is fantastic, Darius. You've really thought about the community and what they need. Great job." Maria nodded in agreement, and soon the others began to chime in, offering feedback and suggestions, but also praise. Even some of the interns who had been skeptical before seemed impressed. Connor, however, remained silent, his expression unreadable. Darius caught his eye for a brief moment, but Connor quickly looked away. Darius felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had done it. He had faced his fears and proven himself, not just to everyone else, but to himself. As the weeks turned into months, Darius continued to grow. He became more confident, more willing to share his ideas and contribute to the projects the team was working on. He began to see the blueprints not just as lines on a page, but as representations of something real, something that could make a difference in people's lives. One evening, Richard called Darius into his office. Darius sat down, wondering what this was about. Richard smiled, leaning back in his chair. "You've been doing amazing work, Darius," he said, "and I think it's time we talk about the next step." Darius frowned, confused. "The next step?" Richard nodded. "I want you to consider applying for a scholarship. There's a program that helps young people from underrepresented communities get into architecture and engineering schools. I think you'd be a great candidate." Darius stared at Richard, his mind racing. College had always felt like a distant dream, something that was out of reach, especially considering his family's financial situation. But now, with Richard's support, it felt like a real possibility. "You think I can do it?" Darius asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard smiled. "I know you can. You've got the talent, Darius, and, more importantly, you've got the heart." Darius nodded, a sense of hope swelling in his chest. He had come so far already, further than he ever thought possible, and now he had a chance to go even further. That night, as Darius walked home, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed since that day he helped Richard's mother. He thought about all the obstacles he had faced, all the doubts and fears he had overcome. He thought about his mother, his sister, and the life he wanted to build for them. As he reached his apartment, Darius looked up at the building, the dim lights flickering in the hallway windows. He knew there was still a long way to go, still so much to prove, not just to the people around him, but to himself. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, like his dreams were finally within reach. He opened the door, the familiar sounds of his home greeting him, the laughter of his sister, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. His mother looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with pride and love. "How was work today, baby?" she asked. Darius smiled, his heart full. "It was good, Mom. It was really good." And as he sat down with his family, surrounded by the warmth of their small apartment, Darius knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them head on. He had already come so far, and he was ready for whatever came next. The days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. Darius had settled into a rhythm. School, internship, home. It was exhausting, but fulfilling. Every day he pushed himself to learn more, to take in everything he could from Richard's team and from the experience itself. He was no longer just the charity case from Lincoln Heights. He was a valuable member of the team. Darius was also growing closer to Richard, and in a way, he found a mentor in him, someone who cared not just about his work but also about his dreams. Richard's encouragement to apply for the scholarship opened a door Darius had never imagined for himself. The scholarship program was meant for young people from underrepresented backgrounds who showed potential in architecture or engineering. Darius's application required a letter of recommendation, something that Richard was more than happy to provide. It felt like a leap of faith, both for Darius and for his family. One afternoon, Richard called Darius into his office, his expression as serious as it was hopeful. Darius stepped in, a sense of anticipation building in his chest. "Take a seat, Darius," Richard said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Darius sat down, his palms sweaty as he tried to keep his nerves in check. "I've got some news for you," Richard began, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You remember the scholarship we talked about?" Darius nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Richard paused for a moment before his smile widened. "You got it, Darius. You got the scholarship." For a second, Darius didn't move. The words seemed to hang in the air, too good to be true. He stared at Richard, his eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. "Are you serious?" he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, his expression beaming. "I'm serious, Darius. You did it. You're going to college." Darius felt the world tilt for a moment, his eyes stinging with tears he tried to hold back. He swallowed hard, the reality of what Richard was saying hitting him all at once. College. A future he had never thought possible for himself, not in a million years, was now within his reach. "I don't know what to say," Darius murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." Richard shook his head, his eyes filled with pride. "You did this, Darius. I might have helped open the door, but you're the one who walked through it." Darius left Richard's office that day with the weight of 1,000 possibilities resting on his shoulders. The scholarship covered tuition and offered mentorship opportunities, something Darius knew would be invaluable. But as he thought of everything that had happened, how far he had come, he also thought of his family and what this could mean for them. His mother cried when he told her. Happy tears, tears of pride, tears of relief. It was a moment Darius would carry with him forever. She hugged him so tightly that he felt like she was trying to squeeze all the love she had for him into that one embrace. Tasha jumped up and down, her laughter echoing through the small apartment. She was too young to understand what it all meant, but she knew it was something good. Over the next few weeks, the preparations began. Darius filled out forms, attended meetings about the scholarship program, and even got to visit the campus where he would be studying architecture. It was all so new, intimidating but exhilarating. The university was huge, with buildings that seemed to touch the sky, wide open spaces, and students bustling about full of purpose. Darius felt like he was stepping into another world, but this time he didn't feel out of place. He felt ready. His final days at Richard's office were bittersweet. He had grown so much there, not just in skills but in confidence. Maria, who had become a good friend, hugged him tightly before he left. She whispered how proud she was of him, how she knew he'd go on to do great things. Even Connor, who had once doubted him, gave him a nod of respect, as if acknowledging that he had earned his place there. Richard organized a small farewell gathering for him, inviting the team to celebrate Darius's accomplishments. There were snacks, drinks, and even a cake with the words, "Congratulations, Darius," written across the top in neat blue frosting. Darius couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth spread through him that he had rarely felt in his life, a sense of belonging, a feeling that he was valued. Richard raised a toast, his voice filled with emotion. "To Darius," he said, holding up his glass. "You came here with nothing but determination and talent, and look where you are now. You've worked hard, you've faced challenges head-on, and you've shown us all what it means to never give up. We're proud of you, and we can't wait to see what you do next." Everyone clinked their glasses together, cheers filling the room. Darius felt his throat tighten, but he managed to say a few words of thanks, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just about the opportunity Richard had given him. It was about the belief, the faith that he had in Darius when no one else did. It was something Darius would never forget. The next chapter of his life began in late August, when he moved into the university dorms. His mother and Tasha came with him, helping him set up his small room with its narrow bed and wooden desk. Cynthia looked around, her eyes wide with awe, and Darius could tell that she was just as amazed as he was. Tasha was full of excitement, bouncing from one corner of the room to the other, her little face lighting up at everything she saw. "This is it, baby," his mother said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is your start. You've worked so hard for this, and I know you're going to do amazing things." Darius hugged her tightly, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he whispered. When they finally said their goodbyes, Darius watched as his mother and sister walked down the hallway, Tasha waving at him until they disappeared around the corner. He stood there for a moment, feeling the quiet of the dorm settle around him, the realization sinking in that he was really doing this. He was really here. The first weeks of classes were a whirlwind. There was so much to learn, so much to take in, but Darius loved every moment of it. He loved the lectures on architectural design, the hours spent sketching out concepts, the late nights in the library, surrounded by books and blueprints. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for it. He was ready for the challenges, for the long nights, for the uncertainty. He was ready to build something that would last. Richard stayed in touch, checking in on Darius from time to time. They would meet for lunch whenever Richard was in the area, and Darius would fill him in on everything he was learning, all the new experiences he was having. Richard listened, his eyes filled with pride, as if he were watching his own son grow into something remarkable. One day, during one of their lunches, Richard brought up an idea. "You remember that community center project you worked on?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "Of course," Darius replied. It was the first project he had ever worked on, the one that had given him the confidence to believe in himself. "Well," Richard said, "I was thinking that maybe, when you graduate, we could work on something like that again, together. I've been wanting to do more for communities like Lincoln Heights, places that need a bit of hope. And I think you'd be the perfect person to help lead that effort." Darius stared at him, his heart swelling with emotion. The idea of going back to Lincoln Heights, of giving back to the community that had shaped him, was something that had always been in the back of his mind. And now, with Richard's support, it felt like a real possibility. "I'd love that," Darius said, his voice steady. "I'd love to help." Richard smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Then it's a deal." As Darius walked back to campus that day, he felt a sense of purpose like never before. He had come so far, further than he ever thought he could, and now he had the chance to give back, to help others the way Richard had helped him. He thought of his mother, of Tasha, of the people of Lincoln Heights who struggled every day just to get by. He thought of the dreams he had once scribbled in his notebook, the buildings he had drawn with shaky hands but unwavering hope, and he knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much to do, still so many dreams to chase. But for the first time, he felt like he was on solid ground, like he had the tools to make those dreams a reality, not just for himself, but for everyone who needed a little hope, a little faith that things could get better. And that, Darius thought, was the most important thing of all. To be able to give others what he had been given, a chance to dream, a chance to believe, a chance to build something that mattered. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Also, check out our other stories that may inspire you. Share this video with your friends and family. Maybe it will be an encouragement and inspiration for them. Thank you for watching.